Chapter 1. The Bennets. It is, of course, generally accepted that a wealthy single man must be in search of a wife. As soon as such a man moves into a neighborhood, each of the families that live there will, without any inquiry as to his own feelings on the subject, immediately consider him the rightful property of one of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said Mrs. Bennet to her husband one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park has been rented at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it has," she repeated. "Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was quite enough encouragement. "Well, my dear, Mrs. Long says that Netherfield has been taken by a rich young man from the north of England, that he came down on Monday to see the place and was so pleased with it that he agreed to take possession immediately, and that some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of the week." "What is his name?" "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear. An unmarried man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 pounds a year. What a fine thing for our girls!" "And why is that? What difference does it make to them?" "My dear Mr. Bennet," replied his wife, "how can you be so annoying? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them." "Is that his intention in settling here?" "Intention? Nonsense! How can you talk like that? But it is likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes." "I see no reason for that. You and the girls may go, or, even better, you may send them by themselves, because as you are as good-looking as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party." "My dear, you praise me too highly. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but when a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give up thinking of her own appearance. But you must go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes." "I cannot promise to do so." "But consider your daughters. You must go, because it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not." "You are too anxious to do what is proper, surely." "I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send him a few words by you to inform him of my complete agreement to his marrying whichever of the girls he chooses, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie. I hope you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, but you are always showing a preference for her. They have none of them much about them to admire," he replied. "They are all silly and empty-headed like other girls. But Lizzie is a little more intelligent than her sisters." "Mr. Bennet, how can you speak of your own daughters in such a way? You take pleasure in annoying me. You have no pity on my poor nerves." "You are mistaken, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have been listening to news of them for the last 20 years. "Ah, you do not know how I suffer." Mr. Bennet was such a strange mixture of cleverness, sharp humor, silence, and unexpected changes of mind, that the experience of 23 years had not been long enough to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to understand. She was a foolish woman. When she was anxious, she imagined herself to be ill. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its pleasure was visiting and news. Chapter 2. New Neighbors at Netherfield. Mr. Bennet was among the first of those who visited Mr. Bingley. He had always intended to do so, though he continued to let his wife believe that he would not go. He finally made his intentions known in the following way. Watching his second daughter occupied in sewing a colored band around a hat, he suddenly addressed her with, "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie." "We are not in a position to know what Mr. Bingley likes," said her mother bitterly, "if we are not to visit him." "But you forget, Mother," said Elizabeth, "that we shall meet him at the public balls, and that Mrs. Long has promised to introduce him." "I do not believe Mrs. Long will do any such thing. She has 2 nieces of her own. She is a selfish, insincere woman, and I have no opinion of her." "Neither have I," said Mr. Bennet, "and I am glad to find that you do not depend on her serving you." Mrs. Bennet would not make any reply, but, unable to control her annoyance, began complaining to one of her daughters. "Don't keep coughing so, Kitty. Have a little pity on my poor nerves." "Kitty lacks judgment in her coughs," said her father. "She chooses the wrong moment." "I do not cough for my own amusement," replied Kitty. "When is your next ball to be, Lizzie?" "In 2 weeks from tomorrow." "So it is," cried her mother. "I and Mrs. Long does not come back until the day before, so it will be impossible for her to introduce him, because she will not know him herself. Then, my dear, you may have the advantage of your friend, and introduce Mr. Bingley to her." "Impossible, Mr. Bennet, impossible, when I am not acquainted with him myself. How can you be so annoying? Well, if you will not perform this duty, I will do it myself." The girls looked at their father. Mrs. Bennet said, "Nonsense, nonsense! I am sick of Mr. Bingley." "I'm sorry to hear that, but why did you not tell me so before? If I had known it this morning, I certainly would not have gone to see him. It is very unlucky, but as I have actually paid the visit, we cannot escape the acquaintance now." The astonishment of the ladies was just what he wished, that of Mrs. Bennet being perhaps beyond the rest, though when the first excitement was over, she began to say that it was what she had expected all the time. "How good it was of you! I was sure you loved your girls too well to neglect such an acquaintance. Well, how pleased I am! And it is such a good joke, too, that you went this morning and never said a word about it until now." "Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose," said Mr. Bennet, as he left the room, having had enough of his wife's talk. "What an excellent father you have, girls," she said when the door was shut. "I do not know how you will ever repay him for his kindness. At our time of life, it is not so pleasant, I can tell you, to be making new acquaintances every day, but for our dear daughters we would do anything. Lydia, my love, though you are the youngest, I dare say Mr. Bingley will dance with you at the next ball." "Oh," said Lydia confidently, "I am not afraid. Though I am the youngest, I'm the tallest." The rest of the evening was spent discussing how soon Mr. Bingley would return Mr. Bennet's visit, and deciding when they should ask him to dinner. All that Mrs. Bennet, together with her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject was not enough to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley. They were forced at last to accept the second-hand information of their neighbor, Lady Lucas. Her report was highly favorable. He was quite young, very good-looking, extremely agreeable, and in addition to all this, he planned to be at the next public ball. Nothing could be more exciting. In a few days, Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit, and sat for about 10 minutes with him in the library. He had hoped to see the young ladies, of whose beauty he had heard a great deal, but he saw only the father. The ladies were more fortunate. They had the advantage of observing from an upstairs window that he wore a blue coat and rode a black horse. An invitation to dinner was sent soon after, and Mrs. Bennet had already planned the meal that was to show the quality of her housekeeping, when an answer arrived which changed everything. Mr. Bingley found it necessary to be in London the following day, and was therefore unable to accept the honor of their invitation. Mrs. Bennet was both disappointed and worried. She began to fear that he might always be flying about from one place to another, and never settled in Netherfield as he ought to be. Lady Lucas quietened her fears a little by spreading the word that he had gone to London only to collect a large party for the ball, and a report soon followed that Mr. Bingley would bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him. The girls were unhappy at the thought of such a large number of ladies, but were comforted to find, when the party entered the ballroom, that it was in fact made up of only 5 altogether: Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the older one, and another young man. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanly. His sisters were fine women dressed in the latest fashions. His sister's husband, Mr. Hurst, simply looked like the gentleman he was, but Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of everyone by his fine tall form, noble face, and the report, which was passed round the room within 5 minutes of his entrance, that he had an income of £10,000 a year. He looked at with admiration for half the evening, until his manners caused a general disgust which ended his popularity. Mr. Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the important people in the room. He danced every dance, was angry that the ball closed so early, and talked of giving one himself at Netherfield. What a difference between himself and his friend! Mr. Darcy danced only once with Mrs. Hurst, and once with Miss Bingley, refused to be introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening walking around the room. Mrs. Bennet's dislike of his behavior was sharpened by his having made one of her daughters appear neglected. Elizabeth Bennet had been forced, by the small number of gentlemen, to sit out for 2 dances, and during part of that time Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough for her to hear, against her will, a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who left the dancing for a few minutes to urge his friend to join in. "Come, Darcy," he said, "I hate to see you standing around by yourself like this. You really should be dancing." "I certainly shall not. Both your sisters already have partners, and there is not another woman in the room with whom I would care to dance." "I would not like to be so difficult to please as you are," cried Bingley. "I have never met with so many pleasant girls in my life." "You are dancing with the only good-looking one," said Mr. Darcy, looking at the oldest Miss Bennet. "Oh, she is the most beautiful creature that I ever saw. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who is very attractive and probably very agreeable. Do let me ask my partner to introduce you." "Which do you mean?" Darcy asked. Turning round, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, until catching her eye, he looked away and coldly said, "She is fairly pretty, but not good-looking enough." He walked off, and Elizabeth remained with no very friendly feelings towards him. But she told the story with great spirit among her friends, because she had a playful nature and a strong sense of humor. The evening on the whole passed off pleasantly for all the family. Mrs. Bennet had seen her oldest daughter much admired by the Netherfield party. Mr. Bingley had danced with her twice, and she had been an object of attention by his sisters. Jane was as much pleased by this as her mother, though in a quieter way. Elizabeth shared Jane's pleasure, as she always did. Lydia and Kitty had never been without partners, and Mary, the least pretty of the family, had heard herself praised to Miss Bingley as a skilled musician. They returned, therefore, in good spirits to Longbourn, the village in Hertfordshire where they lived, and of which they were the most important family. Within a short walk of Longbourn, there lived a family with whom the Bennets were especially friendly. Sir William Lucas had formerly been in trade in the town of Meryton, where he had made a fairly large fortune, and rose to the honor of a title of rank. This honor had perhaps been felt too strongly. It had given him a disgust for his business and for his home in a small market town, and, leaving them both, he had moved with his family to a house about a mile from Meryton, which he called Lucas Lodge. But though proud of his rank, he was friendly and ready to help anyone who needed it. Lady Lucas was a very good kind of woman, not too clever to be a valuable neighbor to Mrs. Bennet. They had several children. The oldest of them, a sensible young woman of about 27, was Elizabeth's special friend. It was a time-honored tradition for the Mrs. Lucas and the Mrs. Bennet to meet and talk after a ball, and so the following morning brought the former to Longbourn for that purpose. "You began the evening well, Charlotte," said Mrs. Bennet, with forced politeness, to Miss Lucas. "You were Mr. Bingley's first choice." "Yes, but he seemed to like his second better." "Oh, you mean Jane, I suppose, because he danced with her twice. Certainly that did seem as if he admired her. It does seem as if, but it may not lead to anything, you know." "But Mr. Darcy is not so worth listening to as his friend, is he?" said Charlotte. "Poor Eliza! To be only just fairly pretty. I hope you will not put it into Lizzie's head to be annoyed by his rude treatment. He is such a disagreeable man that it would be quite a misfortune to be liked by him. Mrs. Long told me last night that he sat next to her for half an hour without once opening his lips." "Are you quite sure, madam? Is there not some mistake?" said Jane. "I certainly saw Mr. Darcy speaking to her." "Yes, because she finally asked him how he liked Netherfield, and he could not help answering her, but she said he seemed very angry at being spoken to. Miss Bingley told me," said Jane, "that he never speaks much except among people he knows well. With them he is extremely agreeable." "I do not believe a word of it, my dear." "I don't mind his not talking to Mrs. Long," said Miss Lucas, "but I wish he had danced with Eliza." "Another time, Lizzie," said her mother, "I would not dance with him, if I were you." "His pride," said Miss Lucas, "does not offend me so much as pride often does, because there is an excuse for it. One cannot be surprised that such a fine young man with family and fortune should think highly of himself." "That is very true," replied Eliza, "and I could easily forgive his pride if he had not wounded mine." Chapter 3. Jane Gains an Admirer. The ladies of Longbourn soon visited those of Netherfield. The visit was formally returned. Miss Bennet's pleasing manners continued to win the approval of Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and though the mother was considered to be unbearable, and the younger sisters were not worth speaking to, a wish was expressed to be better acquainted with the two oldest. This attention was received by Jane with the greatest pleasure, but Elizabeth saw pride in their treatment of everyone, even her sister, and could not like them. But it was plain that their brother did admire Jane, and Elizabeth observed that Jane was giving way to the preference which she had begun to feel for him from the first, and was beginning to be very much in love. While Elizabeth was watching Mr. Bingley's attentions to her sister, she did not realize that she herself was becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend. Mr. Darcy had at first hardly admitted her to be pretty. He had seen her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. But he had no sooner decided that no single part of her face was particularly attractive than he began to find that the whole was made uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. She was completely unconscious of this. To her, he was only the man who had made himself agreeable nowhere, and who had not thought her attractive enough to dance with. He began to wish to know her better. One day, a large party was amusing itself at Sir William Lucas's. A number of young ladies and 2 or 3 army officers were occupied in dancing at one end of the room. Mr. Darcy stood near them, and Sir William was trying to make conversation with him. As Elizabeth moved towards them at this moment, Sir William was struck with the idea of doing the polite thing and called out to her, "My dear Miss Eliza, why are you not dancing? Mr. Darcy, you must allow me to present this young lady to you as a very desirable partner. You cannot refuse to dance, I am sure, when so much beauty is in front of you." And taking her hand, he would have given it to Mr. Darcy, who, though extremely surprised, was not unwilling to receive it, when she immediately pulled away and said in some confusion to Sir William, "Sir, I have not the least intention of dancing. Please do not suppose that I moved this way in order to beg for a partner." Mr. Darcy, with great politeness, requested to be allowed the honor of her hand, but without success. Elizabeth was determined, and Sir William's attempt at persuasion met with no success. "You are such an excellent dancer, Miss Eliza, that it is cruel to refuse me the happiness of seeing you, and though this gentleman dislikes the amusement in general, he can have no objection, I am sure, to doing us this honor for 1/2 hour." "Mr. Darcy is all politeness," said Elizabeth, smiling. She turned away. Her refusal had not harmed her in the gentleman's opinion, and he thought of her with some admiration. The village of Longbourn was only 1 mile from the town of Meryton, a most convenient distance for the young ladies, who usually went there 3 or 4 times a week to make a visit to an aunt, Mrs. Phillips, who was married to a lawyer, and to look at a hat shop just over the way. The 2 youngest of the family, Catherine and Lydia, were particularly frequent in these attentions. They always managed to learn some news, and at present they were well supplied by the arrival of a regiment in the neighborhood, which would remain for the whole winter. They could talk of nothing but officers. After listening one morning to their excited remarks on this subject, Mr. Bennet sharply observed, "From all that I can understand from your manner of talking, you must be 2 of the silliest girls in the country." Kitty was a little ashamed and did not answer, but Lydia laughed loudly. "I am astonished, my dear," said Mrs. Bennet, "that you should be so ready to think your own children silly. As a matter of fact, they are all very clever. This is the only point on which we do not agree." Mrs. Bennet was prevented from replying by the entrance of a servant with a note for Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet's eyes brightened with pleasure, and she called out eagerly while her daughter read, "Well, Jane, who is it from? What is it about? What does he say? Well, Jane, hurry up and tell us." "It is from Miss Bingley," said Jane, and then read it aloud. "Netherfield Park, 10th October. My dear Jane, Will you be so kind as to come to dinner today with Louisa and me? We are all alone. Come as soon as you can on receiving this. My brother and the gentlemen are to have dinner with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley. Having dinner out, said Mrs. Bennet. That is very unlucky. Can I have the carriage? Asked Jane. No, my dear. You had better go on horseback, because it seems likely to rain, and then you must stay all night. Chapter 4. Mr. Collins. I hope, my dear, said Mr. Bennet to his wife, as they were at breakfast the next morning, that you have ordered a good dinner today, because I have reason to expect an addition to our family party. Whom do you mean, my dear? I know of nobody that is coming, I am sure, unless Charlotte Lucas should happen to call, and I hope my dinners are good enough for her. The person of whom I speak is a gentleman and a stranger. Mrs. Bennet's eyes brightened. A gentleman and a stranger. It is Mr. Bingley, I am sure. Why, Jane, you never mentioned a word about this. But, good heavens, how unlucky! There is not a bit offish to be got today. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. I must speak to the cook immediately. It is not Mr. Bingley, said her husband. It is a person whom I have never seen in the whole of my life. This caused general astonishment, and he had the pleasure of being eagerly questioned by his wife and all 5 of his daughters at once. After amusing himself for some time by not answering their questions, he explained, A short time ago I received a letter. It was from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I am dead, may put you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. Mr. Bennet's property was, unfortunately for his daughters, to pass by law after his death to his nearest male relative, a distant cousin. Oh, my dear, cried his wife, I cannot bear to hear that mentioned. Please do not talk of that hateful man. It was a subject on which she could never see reason. But if you will listen to his letter, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself. Hunsford Parsonage, near Westerham, Kent, 15th October. Dear Sir, the disagreement that existed between yourself and my honored father always caused me much anxiety, and since his death, I have frequently wished for a renewal of friendship between our 2 branches of the family. My mind is now made up on the subject. I have recently become a minister of the church, and I have been fortunate enough to become the object of attention of the Lady Catherine de Bourgh. By her generosity, I have been presented with a valuable position in this area, where I shall try to behave with grateful respect towards her. As a churchman, I feel it to be my duty to encourage peace among all families within my influence, and for these reasons, I consider that my offer of friendship is deserving of praise, and that the fact that I am heir to your property will be kindly forgiven by you. I am troubled at being the means of harming your daughters, and beg to apologize for it, as well as to inform you of my readiness to do what is in my power to lessen the wrong done to them. If you have no objection to receiving me into your house, I intend to visit you and your family on Monday next week at 4 o'clock, and would be thankful to remain as your guest until the Saturday of the following week. I remain, dear sir, with respectful greetings to your lady and daughters, your well-wisher and friend, William Collins. At 4 o'clock, therefore, we may expect this peacemaking gentleman, said Mr. Bennet, as he folded up the letter. He seems a most dutiful and polite young man. There is some sense in what he says about trying to lessen the harm done to the girls, his wife agreed. Though it is difficult, said Jane, to guess in what way he intends to do so. Elizabeth was chiefly struck with his high degree of respect for Lady Catherine. As for her mother, Mr. Collins's letter had taken away much of her unfriendly feeling, and she prepared herself to see him with a calmness that astonished her husband and daughters. Mr. Collins arrived on time and was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins seemed very willing to do so himself. He was a tall, heavy-looking young man of about 25. His manner was serious, and his behavior very formal. He had not been seated long before he began to offer his congratulations to Mrs. Bennet on having such a fine family of daughters, and to admire their beauty. He added that he did not doubt that she would in time see them all well settled in marriage. This speech was not much to the taste of some of his hearers, but Mrs. Bennet answered most readily, "You are very kind, sir, I am sure, and I wish with all my heart that it may be so, or they will be poor enough. These matters are settled in such a strange way. I am conscious, madam, of the injustice to your lovely daughters, but they may be sure that I have come prepared to admire them. At present I will say no more, but perhaps when we are better acquainted." He was interrupted by the announcement of dinner, and the girls smiled at each other. They were not the only objects of Mr. Collins's admiration. The hall, the dining room, and all its furniture were examined and highly praised, and his approval would have touched Mrs. Bennet's heart if she had not believed that he was viewing it all as his own future property. The dinner, too, in its turn, was much admired, and he begged to know which of his cousins had prepared the excellent meal. But here he was corrected by Mrs. Bennet, who informed him rather sharply that they could very well afford to keep a good cook, and that her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. He begged pardon for having displeased her. She replied in a softer voice that she was not at all offended, but he continued to apologize for about a quarter of an hour. "I was educated for the church," continued Mr. Wickham, "and Mr. Darcy's father left me, on his death, the best living to which he had the power to make an appointment as soon as it became free. He was my godfather, and he was very fond of me. He thought that he had provided for my future, but the living was given to somebody else." "Good heavens," said Elizabeth. "But surely that was against the law." "My godfather's wishes were not expressed clearly. Mr. Darcy treated his father's words as a suggestion with certain conditions connected with it, and claimed that I had no right to the living because of some imagined wrongdoings of mine. But the fact is that he hates me. This is quite shameful. He deserves that the truth should be made public. Until I can forget his father, I can never be the means of shaming the son." Elizabeth honored him for such feelings. "We were born in the same place, and brought up together. My father managed the late Mr. Darcy's affairs, and gave all his time to the care of his property. I am surprised that Mr. Darcy's pride has not made him fairer to you. I should have thought that he would have been too proud to be dishonest." "It is surprising," replied Wickham, "because his pride has often caused him to be generous, to give his money freely, to be an excellent host and a kind landowner, and to do good to the poor. He also has brotherly pride. He looks after his sister very well. What sort of a girl is Miss Darcy?" He shook his head. "I wish I could call her likable, but she is too much like her brother, very, very proud. I am astonished at Mr. Darcy's friendship with Mr. Bingley. How can Mr. Bingley, who is so agreeable and friendly to everyone, like such a man? He cannot know what Mr. Darcy is." "Probably not. But Mr. Darcy can please when he wishes. He can be a good companion if he thinks it worth taking the trouble. He is a very different man among those who are his equals in the world." Mr. Wickham's attention was caught a little later by Mr. Collins, mentioning the name of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. He asked Elizabeth in a low voice whether her relations were acquainted with the family. "You know, of course, that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters, and therefore she is aunt to the present Mr. Darcy. Her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will have a very large fortune, and it is believed that she and her cousin will unite the two properties by marriage." This information made Elizabeth smile as she thought of Miss Bingley. All that lady's hopes would be disappointed if he was already promised to another. Chapter 6. The Ball at Netherfield. Elizabeth repeated to Jane, the next day, what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She could not believe that Mr. Darcy could be so undeserving of Mr. Bingley's friendship, but it was not in her nature to question the truthfulness of a young man of such pleasing appearance as Wickham. "They have both been mistaken, I expect," she said, "in some way or other, of which we can form no idea." The two young ladies were called from the garden, where this conversation was taking place, by the arrival of some of the persons of whom they had been speaking. Mr. Bingley and his sisters came to give their personal invitation for the long-expected ball at Netherfield, which was fixed for the following Tuesday. Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst appeared very pleased to see their dear friend again, and complained that it was a long time since they had last met. They took very little notice of the rest of the family, avoiding Mrs. Bennet as much as possible, saying not much to Elizabeth, and nothing at all to the others. The thought of the Netherfield ball was exciting to every female of the family. Mrs. Bennet considered it to be given as a mark of attention to her oldest daughter, and was particularly pleased at receiving the invitation from Mr. Bingley himself, instead of by means of a formal card. Jane pictured to herself a happy evening in the society of her two friends, and the attentions of their brother, and Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham. The happiness of Kitty and Lydia depended less on any special event or person. All that they wished for was plenty of partners. Even the serious-minded Mary was willing to go. Elizabeth's spirits were so high that though she did not often speak unnecessarily to Mr. Collins, she could not help asking him whether he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation. To her surprise, he replied that he would go, and added, "I shall hope to be honored in the dance with the hands of all my cousins in the course of the evening, and I take this opportunity of asking for yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the first two dances especially. I trust that my cousin Jane will understand the reasons for this preference, and not think that it is in any way disrespectful to her." Elizabeth felt herself completely at a disadvantage. She had fully intended being promised to Wickham for those same dances, and to have Mr. Collins instead. Her liveliness had never been expressed at a worse moment. But she could do nothing. Mr. Collins's offer was accepted with as much pleasure as she could manage to show. It now first struck her, though, that she was chosen from among her sisters as being suitable in his opinion to be his wife at Hunsford Parsonage. The idea was soon strengthened as she observed his increasing politeness to her, and though she herself was more astonished than pleased, it was not long before her mother let her know that the possibility of their marriage was extremely pleasing to her. Elizabeth pretended not to understand her, because she knew very well that a serious argument would result from any reply. Mr. Collins might never make the offer, and until he did, it was useless to quarrel about him. If there had not been a ball to get ready for and to talk about, the younger Mrs. Bennet would have been in a sad state at this time. From the day of the invitation to the day of the ball, continuous rain prevented them from walking to Meryton. No aunt, no officers, no news could be looked for. Even Elizabeth might have found some test of her patience in weather that delayed the development of her acquaintance with Mr. Wickham, and nothing less than a dance on Tuesday could have made such a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday bearable to Kitty and Lydia. On the Tuesday evening, Elizabeth entered the sitting room at Netherfield and looked without success for Mr. Wickham among the group of officers present there. Until then, no doubt about him coming had entered her mind. She had dressed with more care than usual and readied herself in the highest spirits to complete the winning of his heart. But in a moment, the terrible thought came to her that he had been purposely left out of the Bingleys' invitation to the officers for Mr. Darcy's pleasure, and although this was not exactly the case, his friend Mr. Denny told them that Wickham had had to go to London on business, and added, "I do not imagine that he would have gone just now if he had not wished to avoid a certain gentleman here." This information sharpened Elizabeth's feelings of displeasure against Mr. Darcy, and although she tried to be cheerful, the first two dances brought a return of unhappiness. Mr. Collins, serious and awkward, apologizing instead of paying attention, and often moving wrongly without being conscious of it, brought her all the shame and unhappiness which a disagreeable partner can give. She danced next with an officer. Then she found herself suddenly addressed by Mr. Darcy, who took her so much by surprise in his request for her hand that without knowing what she did, she accepted him. Chapter 8. Netherfield is empty. After breakfast the next day, the girls walked to Meryton to inquire if Mr. Wickham had returned. He joined them as they entered the town, and went with them to their aunt's. He explained to Elizabeth his absence from the ball. "I found," he said, as the time approached, "that I had better not meet Mr. Darcy, that to be in his company might be more than I could bear." Elizabeth highly approved of his good sense. As Wickham and another officer walked back with them to Longbourn, she was able to introduce him to her father and mother. Soon after their return, a letter was delivered to Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and was opened immediately. Elizabeth saw her sister's face change as she read it, but she soon controlled herself, and putting the letter away, tried to join in the conversation with her usual cheerfulness. But as soon as the officers had left, a look from Jane invited Elizabeth to follow her upstairs. When they had reached their own room, Jane, taking out the letter, said, "This is from Caroline Bingley. What it contains has surprised me a great deal. The whole party have left Netherfield by this time, and are on their way to town, and without any intention of coming back again." She then read the letter out loud. It spoke of the writer's sorrow at parting from Jane, and urged her to write frequently. Elizabeth judged this to be insincere. It stated that Mr. Bingley had business in town, and would be in no hurry to leave it again. "It is clear from this that he will come back no more this winter," said Jane. "It is clear that Miss Bingley does not intend that he should. Why do you think so? It must be his own decision. He is free to act as he wishes. But you do not know everything. I will read you the words that hurt me most. I will have no secrets from you." The letter then told of the beauty of Mr. Darcy's young sister, and of Mr. Bingley's admiration for her, and of the family's hopes that they would marry. Is it not clear enough? Does it not plainly state that Caroline neither expects nor wishes me to be her sister, and that she believes that her brother does not care for me? She means, most kindly, to warn me. Can there be any other opinion on the subject? Yes, there can. Mine is totally different. Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you and wants him to marry Miss Darcy. She follows him to town in the hope of keeping him there, and tries to persuade you that he does not care about you." Jane shook her head. "Really, Jane, you ought to believe me. No one who has ever seen you together can doubt his love. But the case is this: we are not rich enough or grand enough for them." Elizabeth spoke comfortingly to her sister, and gradually persuaded her that Mr. Bingley would return later and answer every wish of her heart. To their mother, they decided only to announce that the Netherfield party had left for a short time. Chapter 9. Mr. Collins makes another proposal. The Bennets were invited to dinner with the Lucases, and again, most of the time, Miss Lucas was kind enough to listen to Mr. Collins. Elizabeth thanked her warmly, and Charlotte told her friend that she was glad to be of service to her. This was very helpful of her, but the real reason for Charlotte's kindness was something that Elizabeth had no idea of: a desire to attract Mr. Collins herself. When they parted later that night, Charlotte would have felt almost certain of success if he had not been planning to leave Longbourn. But Mr. Collins, wasting no time, escaped from the Bennets early next morning with great skill. Miss Lucas noticed him from an upper window as he walked towards her parents' house. She came down quickly to the garden, and there, meeting him as if by accident, received his proposal of marriage. Sir William and Lady Lucas were immediately asked for their agreement, which they willingly gave. Mr. Collins's present position made it a good marriage for their daughter, to whom they could give little fortune, and in the future he would be Mr. Bennet's heir. Charlotte was fairly well satisfied. Mr. Collins was neither sensible nor agreeable, but she, on the other hand, was 27, and with little chance of other offers. She decided to give the news to the Bennets herself, and therefore asked Mr. Collins to say nothing when he returned to Longbourn, which he was leaving the next day. When Elizabeth was privately informed by Charlotte, her astonishment was so great that she could not help crying out, "Engaged to be married to Mr. Collins! My dear Charlotte, impossible!" "I see what you are feeling," replied Charlotte. "You must be surprised, very much surprised, as Mr. Collins was so recently wanting to marry you. But I do not expect very much from marriage, you know. I shall be satisfied with having a comfortable home." Elizabeth answered quietly, and, after an awkward pause, they returned to the rest of the family. Charlotte did not stay much longer, and Elizabeth was left to think over what she had heard. The strangeness of Mr. Collins's making 2 offers of marriage within 3 days was nothing in comparison with his being now accepted. She would never have expected Charlotte to give up her finer feelings to gain no more than comfort. She felt that her friend had shamed herself, and she did not believe it possible for her to be happy in the life she had chosen. As for Mrs. Bennet, she was astonished and shocked by the news. A week passed before she could see Elizabeth without scolding her, and a month before she could speak to Sir William or Lady Lucas without being rude. Lady Lucas was not without pleasure in being able to talk to Mrs. Bennet about the comfort of having a daughter well married, and she visited Longbourn rather more often than usual to say how happy she was. Between Elizabeth and Charlotte, there was an awkwardness that kept them silent on the subject. Elizabeth felt that there could never be any real confidence between them again, and she turned with greater fondness to her sister Jane, for whose happiness she became daily more anxious.